I thought because you're really interested in it currently and I'm really interested in it, that we'd start with the soul phone. And so there's a soul switch, keyboard, voice, video, phone. Where are you in the process now of manufacturing these devices to communicate with people on the other side?
Well, we're definitely not at the manufacturing stage. We are, in fact, in the prototype stage, and we are essentially what we call stage 2 of prototype development. Stage 1 was to be able to get an effect that could be replicable and would demonstrate proof of concept. Not a practical device, but a working device. The metaphor that I use is, I call it a Wright brothers moment. So it's when the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk first demonstrated their plane, the first flight lasted all of 12 seconds, and the longest flight was 59 seconds. It was by no means practical. It didn't have any windows, you couldn't do anything with it. But it showed that flight was possible. So the first thing we had to do was to reach a point where we could say that even though it was unreliable, like the airplane was, that we've now shown that flight is possible. That was prototype level 1. Prototype level 2 was to get that reliability to the point where we could do live demonstrations. So we could actually show with an individual hypothesized collaborating person in spirit, or post-material person in spirit, that they could, for example, use this technology and identify who they are. So they could establish to us using what we call a 20-question paradigm, that it's really them versus someone else.
Well, you've done this with mediums, just kind of being interviewed by a neutral person, but this is using the switch where it's an yes, no?
Yes, this is using actual electronic technology. The only purpose here in working with a research medium is to get confirmation that our hypothesized spirit collaborator are actually with the technology. But the third step, which is the one that we are hoping to work on next, but that requires substantially more funding, is to go from a working demonstration that's proof of concept that, let's say, takes 20 minutes to answer 20 questions, which is what it takes right now, to a device that would actually be practical. So, for example, a person could give a yes-no answer, and we would know whether it was accurate or not in 2 or 3 seconds, as opposed to many minutes.
Now, is this using the switch?
What?
What technology are we using here?
Well, I haven't yet explained that to you. We're looking at multiple technologies. One that we're having the most fun with right now, partly because it's very cost effective, is to take advantage of a phenomena that's well known in the world. It's been known for over 100 years, and which became commercially available for the general public in the 1980s with what are called plasma globes. You've probably seen those globes. Matter of fact, I've got a little one here. I can probably put it up on the screen. It's a little globe like this. This is a tiny one. And it has what's called a Tesla coil in the middle. And this was actually developed by Nikola Tesla, and he had a patent for it, where you have this high voltage, high frequency, low amperage voltage generated by this coil, and then there are inert gases in here, so that when you generate this voltage, it will then produce streams of light. And if you take your finger, for example, and you actually touch the glass, the light will be attracted to your finger. You've probably seen those. They're very common. And you can buy them from the Smithsonian Museum, or you could buy them from Spencer Gifts. I mean, they're quite established, artistic lamps and so on. But they're also exquisitely sensitive. And if you, for example, if you put your hand up here like this, if you look at it, you won't be able to tell any difference. It's not obvious that anything's taking place. but with very sophisticated imaging. And you could do this either with more expensive cameras, which we use, but also you can do it with a webcam, because webcams are so good right now with PCs. What you do is you collect lots of images. What we're using right now, we collect 120 images per second.
Wow.
And then what it does is it averages, it superimposes one on top of the next, on top of the next, on top of the next. And that reveals not only a hidden structure in the patterns of the plasma discharge, but you can see shifts in the relative increase in intensity. So, for example, if your hand's up here, you'll see an averaging of more light on the top. If your hand's on the side, you'll see more averaging on the side. In other words, it senses you even though it's from a distance. You can't even walk up to the globe without it detecting it because it's so ultra sensitive, but you can't see it with the naked eye. You can only see it when you do these sophisticated computer averaging and you get baselines and so on. So now the question becomes, well, what if we have one of our hypothesized collaborating members of our spirit team and they put their hands in the globe, on the globe, or even in the globe? And we use very sophisticated averaging techniques, lots of frames and so on. Can we uncover effects in terms of the shifting of the light that you can't see with the naked eye? And the answer is yes.
Wow.
Now, this research has been done, we've been doing this for the past 6 months. I've not published any of it yet. It's not, I haven't given any scientific presentations on it, so I can't give you any more details than just the general principle. But this particular technology, it's very convenient. It's ultra sophisticated in terms of its capabilities for data analysis and so on. And it works. It's sort of, again, like the Wright brothers plane. When they first built their plane, they had wood, they had cloth, and they had very simple tools to be able to get something that was clearly proof that this was possible. And that's a simple piece of technology.
So you've mentioned in one of the websites that Einstein and Bohm and Edison and Tesla and Houdini and Michael Jackson and Susie Smith and Carl Sagan have been helping you. So can you get a sense of what their intent is? What do they want to convey to us in the physical?
That is a very complex question, as I'm sure you're aware. First of all of these individuals, be they lay people like Susie Smith, who, by the way, published a total of 30 books in the field of parapsychology and life after death. She was an authority in the field. She was a journalist by training, and it wasn't until her mid-40s, and she was a skeptic. And then after her mother died, she then became open to the possibility of life after death. Or, for example, Rhonda's mother, who's deceased, her name is Marcia Eklund. Rhonda's my wife. When Rhonda's mother died, which happened before she met me, Rhonda discovered that she was able to get evidential communication from her mother. She didn't know that it was possible for a non-trained medium to be able to get accurate information. And Rhonda ultimately published a book called Love Eternal that lays out her journey that led her to come to the conclusion that she was getting genuine evidence. And then we brought all of this into the laboratory and confirmed it. Now, these two people were very highly motivated, very loving, very smart. Rhonda's mother, for example, became a practitioner in her church. She was involved in healing and so on. These were people who really cared not just about their families, but they cared about humanity, they cared about the planet, they cared about the greater good. And whether it's, quote, more lay people or they're famous scientists like Einstein, Albert Einstein, or David Bohm, or famous entertainers, like Harry Houdini or Michael Jackson, or famous business people. What's in common among all of these people is they were big thinkers. They had big hearts, not just big minds, but big hearts. Mm-hmm. They deeply cared about giving back to the world. and making a difference. And they provide some of the greatest inspiration for us to continue to do this work, even though it's very controversial whenever you mention people like this. So I always try to explain to people, and this is a soundbite, you can quote it. It's not about the team, it's about the technology. And it's not about the technology, ultimately, it's about the transformation. It is about the transformation in humanity when the veil comes down. And just like we can now take for granted that we can fly around the world and now fly into space, we will eventually take for granted that there is no veil separating us. And it's just like traveling to a distant land. Just like you're in California, right?
Right.
And I'm here in Tucson, and I just touched your nose. You know, we're literally this kind of communication. You're in, quote, a different place, but you're still you. Well, they are just in a different place. And when we recognize that, virtually every aspect of human society will go through various degrees of change, if not transformation, as this unfolds.
What's an example of something that you've learned from one of the helpers on the other side that you didn't know, or you hadn't read about them in their when they were incarnating?
Well, okay. There are two different kinds of questions here. I'll give you an example of each. Something that I had, quote, read about but didn't believe. Well, I have to say, I started out as a skeptic in all this, so I had a serious question with everything. I was raised to believe this was impossible by my parents. I was educated to believe this by my scientific training and so on. So I started out, I'm an agnostic in my philosophy, but I was educated to believe that all of this was couldn't possibly be true. And I've had to give up those disbeliefs and open my mind. And one of the things that I learned when I started working in this area is that, and it was described in a book many years ago by Hbo White called, was it Hbo White? No, I can't remember who wrote it, but it's called The Unstructured Universe. And it's a book that claims that just like light can pass through a window, visible light, and electromagnetic waves, for example, radio waves can transfer walls and so on, to them, what we experience as solid is to them unobstructed. So, for example, they don't have to open a door. They can't open a door in our world to it. They can just walk right through it or go right through it. They transmit like electromagnetic waves transmit. Okay? However, what I didn't realize until we actually did the research, as hard as it was for me to come to finally accept, if I take, for example, one of these plasma globes, and then I put it in a casing, in a box, in a chamber, a light-tight chamber, with a camera inside as well. So the camera is looking at this, and otherwise it's a completely black environment, so there's no reflections or anything else, and I'm measuring the momentary change. We can invite a member of our hypothesized, collaborating team to take their hand, put it through the box and through the glass, and we can get effects. And the box doesn't bother them. It doesn't bother them. And the fact that I have difficulty in, accepting that fact, that's my problem. That's not their problem. And so part of this whole post-materialist evolution/revolution in science is recognizing that the world, that nature is far more fluid. Physics is far more novel, to put it mildly, and wondrous than we currently understand. So that's something that I was, quote, that I read about and was taught about. But it wasn't until they actually did research and finally tested it and found that it worked that I was forced to say, okay, this is real. Now, what about things that I didn't know about? And this, by the way, I'm first and foremost a scientist. So there are things that I've learned through mediums, for example, and heard accounts about, which I'm fairly convinced are true. But until I do a controlled experiment, I have to say I don't know. So I've not done the experiment to test this hypothesis, but it's easily testable. And that is, for example, like I'm in Tucson right now, and in my mind, I'm here, and I'm aware that I'm here, and I'm talking to you. But I can simultaneously, in my mind, imagine that I'm in my office at the university, and that I'm looking at a particular sculpture. Now, I can do that in my mind, but I'm doing it in my mind. I'm physically located here. You're seeing that through the webcam coming out of your screen. I'm physically located here, but in my mind, I'm in two places at the same time. Apparently, for them, they can, quote, bilocate or trilocate. They can be in multiple places at the same time and literally be in those places at the same time. And the way that I put it affectionately is, it's easier to multitask after you're done.
Well, in Autobiography of a Yogi, he describes living yogis doing the same thing. So
exactly.
You don't have to be dead to do it.
Well, that's what I've heard. But remember, I'm a boring scientist. So until I can validate something with empirical science, I have to say I don't know. I have to be cautious. A former writing partner of mine, Bill Simon, a wonderful writer who helped me polish my books, he described me as being an orthodox agnostic. And what that means is whether the question is there gravity or is there God? My response is, I don't know. Could be yes, could be no. Show me the data. I'm open. So until I've done an experiment where, for example, we have two different mediums in two different parts of the country, and both of those mediums simultaneously, without knowing it, end up attempting to communicate, for example, with Nikola Tesla or Harry Houdini. If they can both get information simultaneously and get either confirmatory evidence or different evidence, depending upon what the collaborators are instructed to do, that would be a prediction. Or, what I'm really excited about is, once we have multiple technology systems, completely automated systems available, theoretically, if we had a cell phone type technology in California and another one in Tucson, theoretically, Harry Houdini, for example, could be in two places at the same time and use both pieces of equipment at the same time. Future research.
Right. So what's an example of something that you learned that you didn't know from one of the helpers on the other side?
Well, as I said, I didn't know about the bilocation multitasking effect because I didn't know about yoga. So that's something that I learned from him. I should explain to you that because I don't like to focus on things that I can't independently verify, I have resisted the temptation to ask Susie to tell me things I don't know, or ask, Marcia to tell us things that you don't know, or anyone else, because unless I have a way to independently confirm it, I have to take on, quote, faith, the perception and accuracy of mediums. And mediums are not, by no means, 100% accurate.
Right.
The average medium is 80 to 90% accurate. Their perceptions are often colored by their own biases and expectations.
Sure.
And it's very easy to alter their perceptions, and they're not even necessarily aware that it's doing so. So again, I take a conservative position of, once we get a soul switch and we have a soul keyboard and we have soul texting, then if Susie tells me something, I can be pretty comfortable that it's true.
Okay, let's talk. I want to get to your biography, but first I want to talk about research institutions that do the kind of paranormal research that you do. You're involved with the University of Arizona Lab for Advances in Consciousness. Is that the current name?
Yeah, the title is Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health.
And then there's also Canyon Ranch, Windbridge Institute, Eterna. Could you say a word about them?
Sure. Canyon Ranch is, I call it the Harvard of health spas. They're an internationally known health resort.
Oh.
And they have, you can look them up on the internet. They're one of the most sophisticated integrated medicine type health resorts in the world. I had the privilege of being a corporate director of development of energy healing for 11 years. I recently retired from the ranch. We call it the ranch. And they were very supportive of both our afterlife science research and as well as our energy healing research. The Windbridge Institute is a small private institute that was created by a former postdoctoral fellow of mine, Dr. Julie Beischel. And after she finished her fellowship, since it was not possible for her to continue at the university, she created this institute to continue the work. And she does very good work in this
mostly with mediums.
Mostly with mediums. That's correct.
Okay.
What was the other institution?
Eterna?
Oh, Eternia was an organization that was developed to look at spiritually transformative experiences and how they can impact our lives and lead us to live more ethical and spiritually evolved ways of being. It has great visions, but it's mostly just, if you would, present, but not doing very much right now. So these kinds of institutions are non-academic institutions. As far as I know, my laboratory is the only laboratory in the world that is actually doing research focusing on life after death, and particularly technology to detect the presence of spirit.
What about IONS? It's not their focus, but they certainly dovetail.
IONS, again, is a wonderful organization, the Institute for Noetic Sciences. Their main campus is in Petaluma. Dr. Dean Radin is the head of their senior scientist and sort of research division. They're not part of an academic institution. They do very creative work, and they do, if you would, more, quote, conventional parapsychology. I don't do, quote, conventional parapsychology. Mediumship and soul phone technology and so on is more spiritual psychology than it is parapsychology.
What about the Rhine Institute, Duke University? Do you know of other universities?
Right. The Professor Rhine used to be a professor at Duke, and after he retired, they created an institute. He created a private institute, and it continues in his honor. It is not affiliated with Duke University. As far as I know, there is no parapsychology or spiritual psychology or spiritual science going on at Duke. So it's, again, a private institute. University of Virginia has a group in the Department of Psychiatry. I think they call their division the Personality Division or Perception Division or something like that. Perceptual Studies.
Grayson? That's
Bruce Grayson and Jim Tucker and so on. They've done a lot of work on reincarnation, near-death experiences and so on. They are, but they don't do any research in virtually no research in sort of mediumship right now or soul phone technology. As I said, this is very controversial research, and I've been blessed partly because of my seniority and partly because of my funding and partly because of my being very careful to engage in very controlled research. The university has, so to speak, left me alone. They've been kind enough to honor the academic freedom so I can pursue this work.
What about University of Nottingham in UK?
They are more a traditional parapsychology group. I do not know, have not heard of any work that's being done, for example, in the area that you're talking about with me.
And is there any other academic or non-academic research institute that we haven't listed?
There may be, but I'm not thinking of them right now.
You helped start a new institute for post-material researchers. So you might want to say a word about that, the advancement for post-materialist sciences.
Yep. We created the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. It's it's modeled a little bit after the National Academy of Sciences on the one hand, and the Association for the Advancement, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences on the other. It is right now it's a small institute of like-minded individuals, academy really, because it's focused mostly on education, and other than the research that each of the individual members do. But its purpose is to provide a place where individuals who are interested in this transformation in science, from materialist to post-materialist, that they can find a home. There is no single organization, even a parapsychology organization. Many parapsychologists are, quote, materialists, meaning they see consciousness as being created by the physical world. They think of consciousness being created by the brain, for example, and therefore they infer that when the brain dies, consciousness must die, case closed, because the brain is the substrate for consciousness. So their vision is an extension of conventional materialism, as opposed to a post-materialist perspective, which sees consciousness as at least fundamental, on a par with energy and information and matter, that it stands on its own, or that it's actually primary, and so that consciousness actually precedes information and energy, which in turn precedes matter. And what that would therefore mean is that the umbrella concept to all of science is consciousness. Not energy, not information, not matter, but consciousness. That turns everything on its head. It's like the earth isn't flat, it's actually round. It's like the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, we revolve around the sun. It completely flips everything on its head, so to speak. And when that happens, science expands dramatically.
In one of your books, you talked about God as kind of an intelligence and an order and a helpfulness. Does that relate to consciousness?
Yes. I'm glad you brought that up. The book I wrote was called G.O.D, the G.O.D. Experiments, where G.O.D stood for Guiding, Organizing, Designing Process. And so if you talk about what Larry Dossey calls a one mind, which apparently also is a Buddhist concept, the idea that there's a universal consciousness.
Yeah.
It's the, quote, ground of being. It's infinite in its beyond space and time in terms of its capabilities and so on. And literally what we call the laws of physics are an outbirth and an expression of that universal concept. That notion of a universal infinite consciousness, that umbrella consciousness, is what in religious circles we've in the past called God or Yahweh or I'm blocking on the name right now for the Muslim concept of God. What is it?
Allah.
What?
Allah.
Yeah, Allah. I can't believe that. When you reach my age, past 70, names tend to go and you have to be reminded of them. But you get the picture.
Yes.
Whether it's Great Spirit in the case of Native Americans, whether it's the creative intelligence, whether it's source, many different words, but they're all reflecting this universal, conscious, creative intelligence.
How is consciousness different than a quantum information field like you see in non-locality?
Well, first of all, consciousness refers to awareness. So it's dealing with what we mean by something that is, quote, experiencing, has intention, and the like. And so it's what we call the quantum field, for example, and the quantum hologram, to use Edgar Mitchell's phrase. That's more of a mechanics of an expression of the organization of the consciousness than it is, quote, the consciousness. At least that's the way that we would think about it. You wouldn't say that consciousness is the energy. You would say that consciousness has energy, or it can create energy. Now, of course, other people would like to say, well, it's this or it's that. They wish to, quote, equate them, and they may be right. But when you look at the primacy of consciousness concept, it actually says that those things are themselves expressions of this infinite potential rather than the potential itself.
And does it have a component of love, caring, direction, I think is the word you used?
Yes. The conclusion that you have to come to is that, and it's purely rational, I mean, this is completely just simple logic. And by the way, I consider myself, if you ask me, am I a scientist first or a logician first? I would say I'm a logician first and scientist second. Because it is reasoning that then takes you to methods, and you use the methods to make discoveries. And so, and the capacity to put things together, and to use reason and intuition, that mixture is was part of what we mean by consciousness.
But how do you know that it has the quality of emotion like love?
Well, first of all, you get there by reasoning. So what do we mean by love? We can describe love either as an experience. When you have it, you know it. We could also describe love as an intention. Usually it's an intention for kindness, caring, protection, nurturing, and so on. Empathy, compassion, empowerment. It's a very, very rich and complex set of intentions. We can describe love in terms of its behaviors, how we literally, physically treat people, and so on. And when you actually look at or look for evidence, not of the subjective feelings, because the subjective feelings we only know indirectly. I mean, I infer, for example, that you, do you have any people that you love?
Yes.
Do you have any animals that you love?
Yes.
Let's talk about an animal.
Okay.
Do you have to have, what?
I'll get her just a minute.
Oh, good. You're going to get her. Love it. No pun intended. Oh, wow. Who is she?
This is Mia.
Hello, Mia. How old are you?
She's about 15.
Put her up for a second. I want to take a picture of you and Mia. Ah, that is gorgeous. Thank you.
Look up, Mia.
By the way, I'll tell you a little synchronicity. I pay attention to synchronicities.
Me too.
Well, yesterday I was took a break. I'm doing very sophisticated analysis of data that we collected recently on the cell phone project, and I can only do so many hours of it, and I get tired.
Yeah.
And then what I'll do is I'll put on the television and watch some silly program that will capture my attention. And a silly program that I record, that I watch every now and again, is the current version of a detective series where, and I'm blocking on I always forget his name, not Maddox, but he lives in Hawaii and he drives a red Ferrari, and people who know mysteries would know of him.
Was Dan Johnson the actor?
I don't remember the name of actors either.
Right.
But anyway, he's a. So anyway, this TV show, plots are very silly, but they're mysteries. And they involve a beautiful car, and they have beautiful scenery, and he's a very loving guy, and so on and so forth. Well, the one that I watched yesterday, and I haven't watched it in a couple of weeks, featured cats. The primary client was a little girl whose cat that looks a lot like Mia went missing.
Oh.
So it's just funny that, to watch a program, and it really caught my attention with the silly things with cats. I'm looking at the cats, and now you put a cat in my face. So that's our little synchronicity. Anyway, you love Mia. But when you say that you love Mia, I can't feel your love directly. The only love that I can experience is my own. Everybody else's consciousness I have to infer. I infer your love for Mia, but of course you could tell me you love her, and you could give me examples of other feelings that you have and things that you do for her and so on. And from that I can infer whether your concept of love is like my concept of love. So if you feed her and you protect her and you pet her and you take care of her health and so on, and you say loving things to her on and on and on, I begin to say, okay, that looks like love to me. Okay? But I still don't know whether your experience of love is like my experience of love. By the way, I am red-green colorblind, which means I don't see red very well. Consequently, if I, for example, look at a computer screen, we've got multicolors, and my wife Rhonda and we do a lot of work together. She's developed her own capacity to be an evidential medium, which is very convenient, to put it mildly.
Yes.
We'll be looking at the same screen with the same colored patterns of images, and she'll say, Gary, don't you see the lavender over there? I don't see the lavender. I see a bluish color. We don't have the same experience. Now, I can learn to call that blue lavender, but I don't know if I'm seeing what she's seeing, because we know that I don't see a lot of red, and lavender is part of it. Adds red to blue. Okay, so we don't know if you and I have the same experience of love, but we know it can be similar enough because it propels us and motivates us to do the same thing. Neither one of us know if your cat has love. Now, we infer that she has love because she comes to you and she engages and she cuddles with you and she purrs when she's with you, on and on. So we now infer that she has love too. Well, once we understand that love is an inference in everything else other than ourselves, once we understand that, then we can say, to what extent do other things in the universe show love? And it turns out, once you learn how to see it that way, you can discover it. And one of the first people to discover it was this concept like this was Sir Isaac Newton. Very quick story, and I love to share this. Newton developed the theory of gravity, and this theory of gravity was very novel in his day. So let's take, for example, my wallet here. It has mass, and what he said, I apologize for the phone ringing, so that we'll just have to wait for it to stop ringing because we're home. It will end momentarily. Anyway, there's gravity. This allegedly has gravity. Now, what direction does this gravity pull?
Down.
It pulls down, certainly toward the Earth. But does it pull this way? Does it pull this way? Does it pull this way? The answer is that an object pulls in all directions.
Oh.
I mean, think about the sun. The sun's pulling in all directions, and that's why all the planets that are all different places are constantly revolving around the sun. Okay, so this force pulls in all directions. Fact number one. Fact number two, how far out does it pull? Well, according to his mathematics, it extends infinitely into space. So every object that has mass is constantly with this attractive force. Attractive force is pulling on everything else. So we have a mutually attractive force of every object, whether it's little like my wallet, or big like the moon, or bigger like the Earth, or huge like a star, or humongous like, for example, a galaxy, and all these different entities have all these different degrees of gravity which are mutually pulling on each other, attracting each other. So you have a mutual attractive force which is holding everything together. This mutually attractive force is completely dependable, completely trustworthy. Dependable, it's trustworthy, it's universal, and it is embracing it. It's bringing everything together. Now, if I say to you, what does something sound like if two people have a mutual attraction and they're brought toward each other and they can depend on it and it brings them together and so on? What do we call that?
Mutual attraction.
Yes, and we infer that's an expression of love. Love is sort of what brings people together in a mutual way. And ideally, it's trustworthy. Ideally, it's constant, where it can grow, and so on. So, what Newton realized was that his idea of a mutually attractive force that was dependable, trustworthy, unconditional. Didn't matter whether you were a big planet or a little planet, a white planet or a black planet, completely unconditional mutual attractive force. He saw that universal attractive force as an expression of God's love in the universe. So what I'm just trying to share with you is, once you learn how to see it, and the critical thing is learning how to see it, you can find evidence for the qualities. Now, it doesn't mean that love can't occur in different varieties and different complexions, like there's different colors of the universe, in the rainbow. So, what do I conclude? I conclude that of all the creatures that we know, humans have more love than I call those little infinite love machines. We're born with love for everything. Everything that we find of interest, we put everything in our mouth. And people love. One of the fantastic things about being in a university is people have passions for virtually everything. There are people who love stars, there are people who love photons, and there are people who love plants, and there are people who love bugs, and there are people who love politics, and there are people who love music, and it's just this. More than a smorgasbord, I don't know what word to use to express all the different people engaging in their particular loves. Humans have all this love. And either we invented it, and I don't have the chutzpah to say that humanity invented itself, or you can attribute all this to randomness, which is ridiculously improbable, or you conclude that we, which is rational, are a subset of all the energy and information, and anything that we can do, the universal mind can do better.
Ah, that's interesting. So we're a microcosm of the macrocosm.
Exactly. We are a microcosm of the macrocosm, and that's why that's how Deepak Chopra and Menes Kafkas wrote a best-selling book a year or two ago, which was called "You Are the Universe," which essentially says that we are a microcosm of the macrocosm. And everything is a microcosm of the macrocosm, only some systems express more of that than others. And the more complex you are, the greater your capacity to both be aware of and express that complexity of love.
So if we look around the world, it looks pretty dismal. I mean, there's 83,000 little kids starving in Yemen, and Brazil just elected an autocrat, and Hungary's getting rid of the freedom of the press, and Trump is doing his thing. We're destroying the environment. So is that just explained by free will, or why is it that we're so dastardly when we're created from this higher consciousness?
First of all, that's a superb question. Many people have grappled with it. I've grappled with it as well. And my reasoning process is that we're a microcosm of the macrocosm, and that whatever we can do, it's because that potential was built into us. So let me explain what I mean by that. People, used to say, well, if we were meant to, if God had wanted us to fly, he would have given us wings. Well, that is a sort of an argument that somebody could make. And at one level, it's rational. However, what if God gave us the potential to fly, but it was up to us to manifest it? So what the universe does is it doesn't give us things so much as it gives us opportunities to then make choices. It's the notion of an opportunity providing God as opposed to just a overtly giving God. And giving someone an opportunity means that they then have choice. If you didn't have the choice, then people wouldn't take responsibility. So if you're going to build and design an organism where you want it to be able to accept responsibility, it has to be able to have choice and then also pay the consequences of that choice. I mean, the truth is, if we abuse the planet, we and everything else are going to pay a price.
We are.
We don't get we are. No, we don't get the choice of the price that we pay, but we have the choice to harm ourselves or help ourselves. Okay? So I have the choice to be able to take my fist and bang it into this monitor. I have that choice to do that. But I choose not to do that. Why? I don't want to break the monitor. I don't want to break my hand. It won't be good for our interview, so on and so forth. I mean, it's quite stupid. But I also have the choice if I was being attacked by a mountain lion, and in my earlier days, as a species, I needed the capacity to be able to choose when to strike an animal in self-protection, for example. So again, a microcosm of the macrocosm. So if we're, quote, given choice, one of the things that, I was raised in a sort of ultra-reformed Jewish household. My grandparents, at least on my mother's side, were conservative, so I have a little bit of feeling for what Judaism is. But I grew up in an all-Christian community, went to Catholic church with my Italian girlfriends, I played basketball in the Young Methodist League, so I have a feeling also for what Christianity was in those times. And one of the things that the Jewish people have said is, how could God have allowed the Holocaust? What kind of a God would allow people to do such horrible things? Well, it's the kind of God that says, I give you the capability to make your own bed and live in it. You want freedom, you have to take responsibility. With one comes the other. Now, you will pay a price for it because in order to have a healthy system, there has to be constraints, and you have to be able to heal and so on and so forth. And but I'm going to give you as much freedom as you can potentially handle. Now, did you ever see a spiritual comedy called Evan Almighty? It was very silly.
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
You might enjoy it if you're asking these questions. I've seen it many times. I knew the person who wrote the music for it. I was even present when John Debney actually conducted the music for that score. As I said, it's a spiritual comedy of a politician played by Steve Carell, who gets appointed, he becomes a congressman from Buffalo, and he's sort of a skeptical guy. And his wife, when they moved to Washington, says, well, and his motto was, think big and change the world. And the family was praying for things, so he decided to ask God for help in changing the world. And then the comedy becomes is that God shows up in the form of Morgan Freeman and requests that he build an ark and gives him the opportunity to build an ark. Now, and in this very silly movie, there are some pearls of wisdom. And one of them is a scene where bottom line is, he says, Morgan Freeman was playing Almighty. It's his little shirt, which you wouldn't notice unless you watch the movie many times. He says, He says, does God give you health, or does God give you the opportunity to heal yourself? Does God give you your family, or does God give you the opportunity to be kind to your family and bring your family back together? The notion of the provider of opportunities. So, although on the one hand, we have horrific things happening in the world right now, no question about it.
Yeah.
It's obvious. On the other hand, we also have the greatest opportunity to really grow up and make changes. And by the way, I see, and that's what eternity is about. People who have had near-death experiences have these transformative moments. Scientists who have had mystical experiences are now seeing a new way. Post-materialist sciences immediately expand science to the point where all of a sudden ethics and spirituality can be reunited with science. If we can get a soul phone, if we can produce a reliable plane that we can literally use to fly, so that you can call your deceased grandfather or grandson if either one of them has died, or you can gain wisdom from Albert Einstein or Jesus himself. If we could have a real collaboration between here and there, all of a sudden people wouldn't be fearing death. They'd be seeing a greater picture. They would see all this opportunity for hope. And this might provide the inspiration that we need to come together to make the kind of hard choices that we have to make. So I don't hold this against, quote, God or some idea of divinity. But what I do request as a scientist is that if, quote, and I use the word universe, if the universe wants us to believe that it's conscious, then it has to give us the evidence that it is. It has to show us in tangible action that its essence is part of everything we do. And by the way, for me personally, what I find most compelling that pushes me as a scientist to infer the existence of a loving and caring, ultra-intelligent, ultra-creative consciousness, universal consciousness, is what I call super synchronicity.
Yeah, you wrote a book about that.
And I wrote a book about that, that's correct.
So do you think it's fair to say that synchronicity, where two events that seem not to be causal come together, does that evidence of a kind of a guidance? Like we're guided?
Well, if it's just a pair of events, which I call type 1 synchronicity, I would say no, because it could be just a coincidence.
Yeah.
Or it could be some other factor that brought the two together. If there's 3 to 5 of them in a row, then you start beginning to wonder, well, gee, things are happening too frequently. As Susie Smith was fond of saying, it's too coincidental to be accidental. Okay. Or as Yogi Berra put it, it's too coincidental to be a coincidence. But when you have 6 or more events, which I call a type 3 synchronicity or a super synchronicity, what is also called serial coincidence.
Is that like your experience with panthers?
With what?
Panthers? What didn't you see a whole series of panthers?
I did. I've seen a whole series of many things. One that's coming to mind right this second because it's so cute and silly are ducks. I'll give you an example of that because it's so ridiculously improbable, and yet when you look at the combination of it, the only other explanation that's left is some sort of intelligence is having great fun and giving feedback to someone who's actually willing to listen to it. But when you have 6 or more of these events, it becomes so improbable that and when you start looking at it closely, you realize there's a level of scripting, a level of creative coordination that leads you to become very humble and very grateful.
And what was your experience with ducks?
Well, the brief story is that I'll give the first 6. There were a total of 19 that occurred within a 6-week period. Okay, but I'll just take you through the first 6.
Okay.
The first one was that on a Sunday morning, I received an email from a professor of evolutionary psychology that he sent out to a group of people that I had to be on listserv for, and it showed a picture of a 4-legged duck. A cute little duck with its legs up, 4 legs sticking up. Now, I'd never heard of a 4-legged duck. And it was just a duck. And I said, gee, that's funny. What a cute little duck. Of course, I didn't think anything more of it. It's just a duck. That night, I was having dinner with a gentleman who was interested in energy medicine research. And he was with his wife, and I was with Rhonda. We were at the Arizona Inn, which is a lovely place to have dinner in Tucson. And we were talking about, because we were just getting to know each other, we were talking about people's names. And I said, well, my name Schwartz means black in German. And I said, does your last name have a meaning? He says, well, not specifically. He says, you don't have a family crest. I said, oh, some people do. And he says, it's an unusual crest because it has 3 ducks on it. I said, what, you have a crest with ducks? Now, I don't know about you, but first of all, I don't typically see people that have crests, family crests. But if they do, and I've since now, everybody I ask about, they don't have ducks on it. There are all kinds of things that they have. There's almost no things that have ducks.
Right.
So I said, gee, that's odd. Just this morning, I got this email about a 4-legged duck, and now you're telling me about your crest that has ducks. So that's a pair.
Yeah.
So that's type 1. And my response is, gee, that's odd. But I don't interpret it any further. The next morning, I was reading a novel written by a man who's now deceased, although his estate is a new person that sort of writes in his genre. And it's about a detective from Boston. And I did my Ph.D. at Harvard and was in Boston at the time he started writing. And so I like mysteries, so I followed his career. I read all his books over the years. And this character's name is Spencer. And I would savor it when a book would come out, and I would read just a few pages a day. And so I'm reading a few pages. And about 2 or 3 pages in, from wherever I was, the writer gives Spencer the following words. It says, I think we need to get our ducks in a row. Now, Spencer doesn't typically write about ducks in a row. How do I know that? Because I've since gone out and looked at all of his books, because I have them all on. I can determine the probability of him mentioning ducks. It's ridiculously rare. So now I had 3 events. I said, gee, that's odd. Again, I didn't think anything more about it. It was just, quote, odd. But I pay attention to these things. Well, the next day, which was Tuesday, I was giving a lecture in a class that I have taught for years, but I'm currently on a leave of absence from teaching because I'm doing full-time on this research. It's called The Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. And one of the books I read is a book I wrote called The Afterlife Experiments. And I was just describing what was called the Hbo Experiment, which we did, was funded by HBO to demonstrate how you could do research with mediums in a laboratory. And I was explaining to the class, I said, it's bad enough to be doing research with a mediumship. It's even worse to explain to your colleagues that you're getting funded by HBO as opposed to NSF or NIH. But then to explain that the production company is called Lucky Duck Productions. And as soon as I said that, I realized I'm giving a lecture and I'm mentioning ducks in my lecture. Now, I would give this lecture once a year, and in that lecture, I would mention this little joke. And I've stopped in my tracks, because now I have 4. I said, class, forgive me. I said, I feel that I should digress for a second and mention something of what's called synchronicity that's happening in my life right now, because later we're going to be addressing the synchronicity question when we read the G.O.D. Experiments book, the G.O.D. Experiments book. So I briefly told them about these 4 events now. Afterwards, students came up, and there were 2 in particular that were beside themselves with confusion. The first girl said, she says, I'm really upset, she says. She says, I can't believe this. She said, but when you were talking about your duck synchronicities, she said, I put my hand in my sweater, and look what I found in my sweater. And she pulls out in her hand a little plastic duck. I said, how often do you carry a plastic duck? She says, I don't even know how it got there. I said, well, do you have any idea? She said, well, it's really funny, she said, because it was a little chilly today. So I decided to wear the sweater, and the sweater was in the back of the car. And I work part-time taking care of kids after classes. And she said, maybe some kid dropped it or it fell into my pocket. She says, but look, she says, there's a duck in my pocket, and you're talking about ducks. And then there is this older male student next to her, and he is just beside himself. And she says, Dr. Schwartz, he says, you're not going to believe this. He said, I was showering this morning, and I keep my razor. I shower in the shower. I shave in the shower. And I went to grab my razor, and it wasn't there. He says, my razor's always there. I don't not put my razor in the shower. So he says, I don't know where the razor is. So I got out of the shower, put on the robe, and he said, I couldn't find it in the bathroom. And then I asked my wife, she didn't know where it was. And she said, then I went into my daughter's room. I don't know, daughter's 3 years old, 4 years old, whatever it was. And she says, there was my daughter on the floor. And she had my razor, and lined up with the razor were 3 plastic ducks. I said, how often does your daughter take your razor and line it up with ducks? And obviously she had the ducks. Well, she had never done this before.
Wow.
That was 6.
Yeah.
At which point I said, the probability of that occurring by chance is ridiculously improbable. So my next question was, could it possibly have a meaning? And how would I go discovering that? And that's what took me on the duck journey, and I included that as one of the chapters in my book, Super Synchronicity.
Do you think it's like a trickster kind of playful game?
I would say I wouldn't call it trickster, I would call it very, very, very clever sense of humor. And it will be as humorous as the person it's attempting to communicate with. So it's not stupid. It meaning the universe, the infinite teacher, if you would. Okay? So the universe is going to, in my working hypothesis, but this has been my experience, and I've now known hundreds of people who have this kind of synchronicity. So I had a lot of sort of experience in this area. It is as if, just as when I talk to a child, I speak with a different, set of words and complexities and so on. If I talk to a scientist, I'm going to, again, frame it with particular details. If I'm talking to you, a person who is this super smart, clearly skilled writer who's trying to get ideas about visionary scientists and what makes them tick and what motivates them and so on. So I'm, giving you information that I hope will be meaningful to you and help answer your questions, be useful to the audience that you're trying to speak to. Again, microcosm of a macrocosm.
Right.
If we can do that, just think of what an infinite mind can do.
Right. Well, I like the playful aspect of it. I think that's great. Because the ducks don't really do anything but be playful.
No, that's not true.
Ah.
It turned out that when I started exploring this further, I was given a profound lesson. And maybe I should take you through the turning point with the ducks for me. After a few more ridiculous duck synchronicities,
I love it.
I'm so, quote, upset by it, because it made no sense to me whatsoever, that in those days, I had I took part in a research, it was a mediumship development circle that was led by a woman who was a very gifted medium, and she also, quote, channeled, claimed to receive communication from someone she called, a group she called the Council of 12. And there are many people who claim to have these kinds of experiences. And I was more of an observer as opposed to a participant, and I was watching how she taught these people how to develop their mediumship skills. And she would often, would go in and receive communication. And so I decided I said, I have to ask you this question, and the group can chime in. I said, I've been having this crazy thing with ducks, and I don't understand what this means. Could you please ask the Council of 12 and tell me if this has any meaning?
Good.
So I did. And the Council of 12, according to her, coming through her, says, we don't need to tell you what it means. You already know. And I said, no, I don't know. I do not know what it is. And then they said, in paraphrases slightly, yes, you do. You have a connection to ducks. I said, no, I don't. I don't have any pet ducks. I don't go shooting ducks. I don't have a collection of ducks. I don't read about ducks. Ducks are not part of my life. And then they start yelling at me. I've never been yelled at by a group of alleged spirits before. And through this woman, they're saying, yes, you do. You just don't remember. You had an early connection to ducks, and you know what the meaning of that is. And I said, no, I don't. I don't know what you're talking about. And then it said, well, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, and all of a sudden, I got it. Here's why. It turns out, and I've forgotten this, that the way the book ends, the Afterlife Experiments book ends, is that I explained to people that I ultimately learned, at least working with mediumship, that I was never going to be able to prove that life after death was real. And the reason is because I can't prove to you that I'm conscious when I'm here. I can tell you that I'm conscious. I can share with you what I'm feeling, but you can't feel what I'm feeling. You can only know indirectly through what I tell you and what my actions. You don't know how I see red, and I don't know how you see red. Okay? All we can do is do certain kinds of comparisons and so on. And if I can't prove to you, if you're a skeptic, that I'm conscious and I'm here, how am I going to prove that I'm still conscious after I'm dead? So I realized that what we do is we infer consciousness. So I infer by your interaction with me, by, like if I say, for example, what's your name?
Gail.
Gail. And where do you live, Gail?
Chico, California.
Chico, California. And do you have a cat?
Yes.
The cat's name is?
Mia.
Mia. I gather you've written books?
Yes.
And are you conscious?
Yes.
You sure?
When I'm asleep, I may not be, but when I'm awake, I am.
Okay. Often when I do this, and I ask people, are they conscious? They don't just say yes. What they'll do is they'll say, I think so, or last time I checked, or I hope so, or of course, and then I will ask them to explain. You just said yes right out, but I know you really yes. So then I asked you for more detail, and then you explained something about consciousness, which is that we're typically not conscious of the external world when sleep, and so on. I infer that you're conscious. And the metaphor that I use for people, and that's how I end the book, is that if it walks like a duck, and it talks like a duck, and it smells like a duck, at some point you're willing to say,
it's a duck.
It's probably a duck.
Got it.
Now, what I realized was that the same thing applied to super synchronicity and inferring God consciousness.
Got it.
So if the string of synchronicities, if the total package requires that gee, it sounds like somebody's really smart, who's got tremendous power, that's manipulating all these different people, unconsciously having them do things that they simultaneously share with me when I ask the right questions. When you really try to analyze the sophistication of what it would take to have all of this come together at this particular moment in a receptive individual, if it walks and talks, and smells like a super intelligent mind, then it probably is.
Got it. So it was profound.
Was the big message.
What? It was profound. It wasn't silly. It was a profound message. I see.
Well, it was silly and it was profound.
Got it. So God has a sense of humor. Just to be clear, what else does post-materialist, in this new paradigm, this revolution in science, what else does it involve besides a recognition that consciousness is primary?
Well, first of all, it changes the way you do experiments. It leads you to recognize that you, the experimenter, and your consciousness and your expectations can potentially be interacting with the experiment that you're running.
Quantum physicists have told us that. The observer changes whether it's a particle or wave.
Of course. That's what quantum physics has said. And they've inferred that consciousness was part of it, but they didn't make it primary. And the average quantum physicist never controls for the experimenter's consciousness. The average physicist never does a double-blind experiment. The average physicist never studies the impact of the mind as playing a role in what's taking place. So the first thing it does is it leads you to whether you're doing work at subatomic particles or whether you're studying the dynamics of cells, or there's a whole range of scientific areas where consciousness could be playing a part literally in the results themselves. That's one area. The second area is that what we call parapsychology is no longer para. It's mainstream. It's actually reflecting more the essence of the universe than an anomaly that is outside the realm of science.
In terms of mind over matter, like placebo?
In terms of, yes, it's not placebo. What we call placebo is no longer placebo. It's literally the effects of conscious intention, affecting and interacting with the physical world. It leads you to, and what's important also here is that, you know how general relativity was a bigger theory than Newtonian gravitational physics. Newtonian physics became a special case of a bigger theory. Okay, and you could use Newtonian math, and it works quite well, but it's not the correct explanation, according to Einstein. You need a vision where time and space are not fixed. You need a vision that is bigger, that allows for relativity to occur. And as you start approaching the speed of light, then Newtonian physics literally doesn't work. But in many ways, it quote, works. So what this says is that post-material science is not anti-material. It's just bigger than material. It's an expanded vision. And in many areas, science can go on just doing what it's doing because it, quote, works. But it doesn't mean that it's a correct explanation. And it will never make the predictions, and it will never allow for these other phenomena unless you expand your theoretical umbrella. So it's not rejecting all of science, but quite the contrary. It's embracing all of science, but it's reframing it so that you have a bigger perspective, which also means that you can make sense of data that doesn't fit, and you can make new predictions that can be tested, confirmed and disconfirmed, and so on. It really is an expansion of science, but it reverses and it changes the way you experience what you're doing.
It adds another dimension, which is the observer consciousness.
But in the process of adding that dimension, it transforms the way you think about the lower dimensions. That's what I'm saying. Relativity theory says that Einstein's theory is wrong. They're not competing theories. Einstein's theory is the bigger theory, but Newtonian math works within a certain range of relativity. So it's not just an additional dimension. Post-materialist science goes further than that. It says that we're going to reframe the way we think and teach, for example, how we understand the brain and what the brain is capable of doing. The brain becomes much more a brilliant antenna receiver than it is a creator of consciousness. We'll make more discoveries about the brain by seeing it more correctly. That's the vision.
They've done, I think this happened at a hospital in Arizona that I read about, where a woman was having surgery, her brain was dead physically, and then afterwards she described, you inserted a tube in here, and this person said this, and this person, so her brain was dead, but her mind was very aware of everything that was going on.
That's correct, and there are many thousands of cases of people having experiences during surgery where they validate certain qualities of what was taking place, and some of them are, what are the words? They're the strongest evidence for drawing conclusions, and hers was one of them.
It takes a lot of courage to do this kind of new science. What was it about the family that you grew up in that encouraged you to be an independent thinker and to get into Harvard? And tell us a little bit about your boyhood.
I have to share something, Gail. I've done many interviews over the years, but no one has ever asked me the question in exactly the way you worded it. So I would like to address it the way you framed it. Was there something in my family, in my upbringing, that not only encouraged me to be creative and open-minded, but also encouraged me to be brave?
Yes.
Okay. And so I would like to give you an answer that I've never given to anyone else before, partly because no one's ever asked me the question, and I typically just have to think about it. The creativity part is simpler to explain because my mother was a musician. Actually studied at Juilliard, but never finished graduating because she got married, got pregnant with me and the first child, and so she didn't graduate as a pianist, and then eventually went back to school and became a grade school teacher. But she was a very creative woman. My father was a very creative man. He was also a musician, but he was a scientist and an engineer.
Oh.
Loved chemistry. I mean, he would get excited for molecules like you get excited for Mia. I mean, he just had this joyful love of chemistry. They both loved music. They were both very loving, passionate people. And they encouraged me to be creative. They rewarded that. I wasn't punished for it. And I was given a lot of freedom, probably too much freedom in terms of my musical career and so on. But they erred on the side of encouraging me to be creative and playful. For example, I loved animals as a kid. We grew up when we moved to it was called North Babylon, which is on Suffolk County, New York. It turned out my parents moved to this development, and behind the development were woods, and behind the woods was a lake. And as a child, I'm talking, anywhere 8, 9 years old through 13, 14, I would spend hours in the woods and so on. And I loved animals, and I started collecting all of nature, the animals that were around there. So I had, for example, multiple swimming pools, and I had snapping turtles, and I had water snakes, and I had painted turtles, and I had carp, the fish that were local, and I had rats, and I had all kinds of creatures, whatever was local. I had a little menagerie. My parents tolerated it. that's a lot of critters.
Yeah.
You know? Or I had a chemistry lab in the basement, and I had a physics lab in the basement, and I had an electronics lab in the basement. I mean, my parents encouraged me to play that way. I played rock and roll, I played jazz. So the creative side, I can say that I was really blessed that way. But the interesting thing is courage. Did my family model courage? And I've not thought about this before, but the answer is yes. For example, my mother had very strong opinions. Some of them were appropriate, some of them were less appropriate. But if she had a passion, she went for it. And she stood up, you know, if there was if the garbage wasn't being collected properly, she fought the garbage man. You know. If her child was not being given an appropriate grade, for example, or an opportunity, she fought for her children. I would have to say that something that my mother modeled was standing up for what you believe, and pursuing it vigorously and with passion. And my father, who was a chemical engineer, all but dissertation from Columbia, and then due to rampant anti-Semitism in the chemical engineering program at the time, ended up not getting his Ph.D. Nobody did during that World War II era, and he gave up his dream to be a Ph.D. engineer and instead went into his father's profession, went back to school also at Columbia and got a degree in pharmacy, and then had a little pharmacy, a little drugstore called Northby Pharmacy. He worked every day, 7 days a week, often 10 hours a day, because he was building this business, and until he could afford a part-time second pharmacist, he had to run the store. And although it was not his passion, nonetheless, he did it. He as long as it was, eventually, of course, the Walgreens of the world bought out the little drugstores, and his business ended up no longer surviving, and then he became a hospital pharmacist, which he enjoyed much more. Of course, at much better hours, and so on and so forth. But again, there was that, they modeled strength. And I can honestly say that I was blessed to be encouraged both for creativity and I think for courage. And hopefully I'm honoring that at this stage in my professional career.
Right. And how many siblings did you have?
I had one younger brother who academics was not his cup of tea. I think he went to 1 or 2 years of college. Ended up going into his father-in-law's business, which was running a charter fishing boat, and then ended up heading the business. He been happily married for, 40 years, 45 years, I don't know how many years married. He's got kids, he's got grandkids, very special person. But we are, in some respects, we're as different as day and night. I was the academic and he was the more general person.
Kids have a way of doing that, of sorting it out. You're going to be this, so I'll be that. Yeah. What made you decide to go into psychology?
That's an interesting question. I started off as an electrical engineer. I was in first year electrical engineering at Cornell, and within a few weeks discovered that I didn't quite fit in. And so I transferred from electrical engineering into arts and sciences, became pre-med, was going to be a philosophy major and a chemistry minor, and was going to go off to medical school, either to become an anesthesiologist or a psychiatrist, two different professions which care about reducing pain and suffering in people. And I happened to take an introductory psychology class and then an abnormal psychology class, and discovered this field called psychophysiology, which is the relationship between mind and body. And this was a relatively new field at the time. There was a young assistant professor. His name was Dr. Harold Johnson, and he was just applying for his first NIH grant. And this is 1964, to date myself. And it involved like putting electrodes on different people's body, measuring brain waves and heart rate, and blood pressure, and so on, and sweat gland activity, and then presenting, for example, emotional slides of different emotions, and then measuring people's reactions to it. And I discovered that that particular field integrated philosophy, electronics, chemistry, biology, psychology,
Physiology,
medicine, psychosomatic medicine, placebo effect, and so on. And so I ended up becoming a psychology major, chemistry minor, pre-med, and focusing in psychophysiology. And that's what I did my undergraduate honors thesis in. And I was originally going to do a joint MD Ph.D. program with a Ph.D. in psychophysiology and clinical psychology, but there were no joint programs that did both of them. So I decided to do my Ph.D. in clinical psychology with the psychophysiology focus, and then go back to medical school. And then what happened was, due to a strange set of circumstances, I ended up at Harvard, because I originally went to the University of Wisconsin, and I'm going to say something really funny. Doing research at Harvard, also at Cornell and the University of Wisconsin, but really at Harvard, it was like a duck to water. By the way, one of the things I've learned various metaphors of, duck metaphors, because I really appreciate ducks. So we talk about walks like a duck, talks like a duck, that big message, and of course getting your ducks in a row, having water rub off rub off like a duck's back, which would deal with unfair criticism and so on and so forth. But I think it was like a duck to water. Anyway, to make a long story short, I was so successful, and I was offered assistant professorships at both Stanford and Harvard at that era, that I decided to postpone going to medical school so I could continue my research. And then when I was offered a tenured professorship at Yale, it's a tenured faculty person, I don't know, 33, 34, something like that. I was then going to go back to medical school at Yale, but I realized that the research was flourishing and it was so much work. So I decided that it was easier to collaborate with physicians than become one. And so that's how it happened.
So you were born in June of what year in New York?
Neal, New York, June 14th, 1944.
I'm June 12th.
Really?
Yeah.
What year, may I ask?
I'll tell you when it's not recording.
Okay, you got it.
I need to go pick up my grandson from school. I'm hoping that we can continue this